Here to talk about Venice and Barcelona and any other cities that have any kind of similarities with them. Both Venice and Barcelona are, in their different ways, very successful in attracting tourists. However, their tourism success has led many local residents to consider the adverse consequences and what can be done about them. In Venice, an estimated 25 million people, made up of tourists, day trippers and commuters, compete for the use of the historic centre of Venice, a non-extendable surface area of 700 hectares, with a residential population that has fallen to just 58,000 from 175,000 in 1951. From April to the end of October, the main routes are excessively crowded, leading to queues and congestion. Tourism has crowded out other activities in the historic centre, and it is now virtually a monoculture of tourism. Tourists visit the historic centre and the museums compete for their attention. The historic centre, much to the irritation of residents, is seen by visitors as an open-air museum. Tourists arrive, depart from Venice by plane, coach, car, train and cruise ships. Of those that stay in Venice, 60% stay in hotels for 2 nights or so, and 40% in non-hotels for 3 nights or so. 70% of tourists are day trippers to the historic centre. Barcelona is quite different. Its residential population is much bigger than that of Venice at 1.7 million. The number of visitors has grown rapidly to 7.4 million in 2014. People again arrive by plane, car, coach, train and cruise ships. They stay in hotels and increasingly in non-hotels. The reasons for visiting Barcelona are very different from those in Venice. Although there is some cultural tourism, many come for excitement and for fun. The connections, interacting mobilities and motives for those visiting Barcelona, whether for work or play, give the city a strong buzz. Many younger visitors, so-called hipsters, come to Barcelona by low-cost airlines, book on Airbnb, and stay in residential areas not really adapted for the rowdier sort of tourism. The main routes of Las Ramblas and the Gothic Quarter, etc., are often as congested as those of Venice. Tellingly, Barcelona has become, said one resident, not a city to live in, but a theme park like Venice and Prague. This, in brief, is the current context, and there are no easy answers. The tourist-dependent population will continue to seek to increase the number of tourists and their revenues, subject only to a reduction in the quality of the visitor's experience as the intensity of use approaches the capacity limits of the tourist attraction. On the other hand, a relevant part of the residential population neither directly or indirectly gets any possible benefit from tourism activities. This group will attempt to minimize the effect of tourism, particularly the cost of tourism, such as congestion, fumes, queues, noise, higher prices, and the cost of tourism falling onto residents through municipal charges for security, human waste, trash, and maintenance. We're fortunate today to have an excellent high-level panel who will help to give us insights on where we go from here. What I'd like the panel to do is to think not only of the vision of what can be done by the private sector, but also by the public authorities responsible for managing the balance between commercial and residential interests to help sustain a thriving city. So who have we got here? First of all, we have Antonella de Medici, who is the first person here on my right of Starwood. He is Managing Director of Starwood for the Venice region, with his base at one of the most wonderful hotels that I know in the world, the Danieli in Venice Historic Centre. We then have Jordi William Carnes, who is General Manager for Barcelona Tourism, who insists that he is partly English and be connected in some way with anywhere, he says. And then we have Gary Wilson, who's MD for Product and Purchasing from TUI. And we have Nikki White, Head of Destinations and Sustainability at ABTA, so that's the commercial too. And then on my far right, we have Marcio Favilla, who is Executive Director of UN WTO. He's from Brazil, but able to give us a world perspective on the issues. Welcome to Foggy London. I am Martin Brackenbury. I'm the person who is going to be moderating this session for the next just under an hour. So let's enjoy how we begin. Let's see how we go. First of all, we begin, Antonella, with Venice. Venice, as I described, has a historic centre which is very concentrated in terms of the numbers that go there, and the number of people actually living there has dropped. There is also the broader area of the whole of Venice, because you've got Margate and places like this which are no longer active in the same way. It may be that in various ways the whole of the Venetian region can be looked at in a different way apart from the historic centre. So I'd like you to think about the historic centre as itself, and then also about the broader area and way in which it might be regenerated. So please, Antonello.
Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for inviting me at this panel. I have to say that after we had a brief chat in Venice with Martin and with his other colleague, that they were asking for a different perspective of this type of dilemma between sustainability and the city of Venice. Our discussion was mainly rooted into two big directions. One is what we are doing wrong, and the other what we can do better. What we are doing wrong is sometimes the effect of the magnitude of impression in all media with the spin effect of the digital media about a crowded city, a difficulty of walking the calle or calle that are very similar to my Spanish friend roads. The problem is that when you have millions of people traveling into 8 months in a city that has a very narrow center city town, then of course that becomes a real problem because everybody wants to be nearby St. Mark's Square. So the question is this still something that is useful for the city, or the magnitude of the number of people that are coming are not only bringing value to the city, but are creating more problems and costs for the sustainability of the model? And what are the reactions for the inhabitants? How many are there? Less than 50,000. So the main question to answer to that is to look at Venice the other way around. Venice is in reality sitting on its heritage, art and culture, the magic of Venice, because if you search on the web with keywording, Venice is one of the only cases in the industry where you can find synonymous of experience and emotion, not only other cities associated to the research. So the qualitative part of Venice is the emotional part. Are we able to capture the emotional part by having millions of people traveling in the calle? Probably the answer, of course, is not. But the problem lasts from, let's say, decision taken from the last 20 years in the city. No one is taking care of a strategic development plan for the city. So the governance of the city and the possibility of the city to react by building projects around tourism as a resource is limited to the peaks of the fantastic exhibition with the Biennale of Art, with the Biennale of Architecture, with the Film Festival, and with many other specific exhibitions that are giving credit to the city, opposite to the fact that many other people are looking to the city in the media and the TVs, and they're looking just only to a crowded place. So we need to find out a different balance between that. The destination of Venice is suffering because should be spreading out a little bit more. Venice has a very fantastic territory around herself. In less than an hour, you can reach to mountains, to beachside, to fantastic lakes like the Garda Lake on Verona, to other historical cities from Treviso to Padua to Vicenza. So the point is that if we still look at Venice the old way, Venice will collapse. So we need to expand Venice into the Venetian, let's say, expanded region as a resource, interacting, moving people from different hubs and not inflating the city in the same place. But to do that, we need to have a vision of Venice that will be much more effective in terms of how to host real people that are traveling to visit Venice rather than what I call it jumpers. Now they come for less than 1 day, they disembark from some of the mass cruise lines, they come into the city and they walk away. Or they're coming from, let's say, the neighbors, and they're just coming, not even by train, just by bus sometimes. So this type of tourism is just looking at Venice like a museum. That's the lingo that sometimes we heard into the expert and the markets. How we can transform a museum into a live city? That's the key question. So we need to work on the other way around, thinking about what are the projects. The Arsenal is a fantastic place that has been recuperated for part of the exhibition of the Biennale of Art and Architecture. Still, there is a huge place that can be developed as a new site for hosting events and special exhibition. Then we have all the Marghera sites, where we have industrial sites that are obsolete and now should be turned into project areas. I was walking here this morning and I remember very well that the Excel concept is similar to the one that I experienced in Abu Dhabi, with the same type also of hotels like the Aloft. And it's interesting how the blend between a fantastic conference center and hotels that are hosting the hospitality for conference can become an alternative to the flow outside of the historical center. So using the historical center as a gift and not only on the sole proposition to answer to this question. If we think about culture, we need to look at the calendar. Venice has a calendar that is very shrinked into the summer season. So the question will be, is Venice not nice during the winter? Why we don't have something during Christmas, for example, in Venice? Now, and that's one of the examples for a city that is very safe, because you can host the Christmas market in Venice and lasting there for a couple of months until Carnival, that becomes another feast. Historically, Carnival was lasting for 7 months. Now we are having a couple of weekends plus, let's say, 10 days. So it's a risk that can be offset by having a strategic vision on how we can turn the asset of the city. But we can never do this if we look at tourism as not an opportunity to invest. So we need to facilitate real investors that are thinking not only what are the troubles of investing in a city like Venice, cost of transporting, cost of building, cost of labor. So if we can give to a city like that the opportunity, also through the Italian government, of special conditions of developing the resources and attracting investors, then the city with a plan can be really something that is special. Imagine that in Venice we already have 4 or 5 foundations for contemporary art, for modern art, for cultural institution. And it's important to have this type of invention, because Venice is a city that can be the hosting place for all the international foundations. And if we bring this, we bring congresses, we bring workshops, we bring people that are coming to universities to learn and to practice into projects. So there is a new blood that we need to put into the vein of a city like Venice, because the body in itself is a beautiful old man body. But we need to put something different to give hope to a city like Venice.
Thank you very much. That gives very much, as it were, a business person's vision of what should happen in Venice. Let's hear now from Barcelona. Jordi, if you can give us a picture of how you see Barcelona and your own role, of course, because you are in charge of tourism for the city.
Right. Thanks very much for inviting us to be here. First of all, Barcelona 23 years ago was not in the maps. We just is a good example of one of these big events which from time to time takes place. So we are a little son of an Olympic game. Now, before 1992, we just textile, industry, services. After 1992, we just appear on the map. Now, 23 years later, I would say we are in the process of adapting and innovating ourselves. What does it mean? One, we realized last year that we have some problems we already stood and wrote in terms of concentration in some areas. So we have the challenge of using and working with mobility, the flows, the people in some areas. That's a challenge. How to do it? Do we introduce ticketing to access in some areas? That's something we already started to do in some areas. Two, how make the combination of people living in one area and people visiting that area. So the combination of citizens and visitors, that's a challenge. We don't want people to abandon those areas, so the combination is obvious, but it's not so evident how to put it into practice. Third, these new forms of lodging. You can like it or not, but it's already a reality. So these B&B or bookings or whatever you wanted to call it, it's there. You can't say, I don't want them, because they're already there. So it's like, let me put it an example. It's as a certain debate Europe is having with people from other continents. People like it or don't like it. I don't say that my opinion. I say that's a reality, and you have to work with that reality. So our main concerns at this moment is one, mobility, two, excessive concentration in some parts of the city at certain periods of the year, third, this lodging and the problems which comes around and the combination of how people live and how people also make use. And this comes with, let's say, behavior. I would say these are the 3 or 4 challenges. We are starting and readapting the, let's say, the strategic plan of the city linked with tourism, and I think that we can do it only in 3 ways. 1, work with the private sector. 2, work with the public sector. 3, work, let's say, in a combination of all these elements. Easy to say, but that means hours and hours and hours of talking and make this combination possible. There's no other solution than sitting down and listen to the demands of the citizens and listen also to the demands of the, let's say, entrepreneurs. It seems easy to say, but that means also a lot of effort to understand, because richness, which is tourism, is a very powerful industry, is also a question of distributing its benefits and spread these benefits to all the city, or at least not only to the city but the neighborhood. As a friend from Venice said, it's not only a question of Barcelona, it's a question of a broader Barcelona. Barcelona itself is very small. It's only 100 square kilometers. It's 1.6. That means 16,000 inhabitants per square kilometer. That's a lot. So we have to spread also its impacts and its benefits, not only in the city, but in the neighborhood. I think some of these ideas, I think it's been also said in some of the cities, but that's what we're trying to do, because the most fundamental thing is when you come to visitors, you have to feel like being a Barcelona. That means feel a special interest and a special experience. And that means that the people who live there have to still feel comfortable and satisfied for what they're doing. That's a challenge.
It is a challenge. And one of the interesting things, Gary, if you can come in now, if you look at the situation with people traveling on low-cost airlines and booking through Airbnb in non-hotels, this is the non-organized sector which is getting very substantial in some cities, particularly in places like Barcelona. You who represent the organized sector, very much so, how do you see Barcelona and Venice and actually trying to deal with some of the issues which have been raised by your 2 colleagues on the left?
Thank you, Martin. Can you hear me? I'm afraid to say I don't actually have a great deal of knowledge of either Barcelona or Venice, but what I can talk about is the destinations which we visit and the experiences that we have with the stakeholders and how we try to manage that. At TUI, we have about 20 million customers who visit over 100 destinations every year. And I think that just walking around the fair today and in previous years, my God, how many of these destinations would love the problems that we're talking about with Barcelona and Venice, of far too many customers, of far too many tourists, because there are so many people here today who have no tourists, who have very few tourists, and are fighting for every dollar and every pound that they can get from the tourists. So I think that we should step back and just put into context, you know, what the problem is versus some of the other problems that exist at the moment within a tourism sector. That said, if there is any imbalance and if there are any stakeholders involved in tourism who feel that they are not being represented, then surely that imbalance comes to the fore. And from what I hear within Barcelona and within Venice, that's happening. And I think that one of the very important approaches really that has to happen is there has to be a collaboration between the main players, and there has to be a collaboration between the stakeholders. And we found one of the most effective ways for that to work is by setting up destination councils or destination groups, where you can understand who are the people who are going to be affected by tourism, positively and negatively, within any destination or any sector. And you get these people around a table and you understand what the concerns are, and you try to mitigate those concerns. Because we carried out a piece of work last year with PwC and the Travel Foundation, a piece of work called Total Impact Measurement and Management, where we looked at the impact that TUI had on tourism within Cyprus from an economic and environmental, a social and a tax perspective. And one of the headline that came out of that is that the positive benefits, both from an economic and a tax perspective, far outweigh any negative benefits that could be had in some of these destinations. And I think if that is the case, then we need to understand what are those negative factors, and how do we engage with the stakeholders in order that we can understand them and mitigate them. And just on to the part about disintermediation. We're obviously the largest integrated travel company in the world, and with that I think comes a huge responsibility, but I don't think you need to be huge or need to be large to understand that if you're taking out of a destination or taking out of a city, you need to be giving back as well. And I think what's very important is that, you know, any players who are, you know, making significant or making any profits or are taken from a destination, they have a mechanism by which they're giving back. And I think that can be, in our case, sitting down with hoteliers and understanding exactly what the key factors are that those hoteliers need to put in place in order to be able to give a sustainable experience to the customers and a responsible experience. And with programs such as Travel Life and other accreditation programs, you know, we're working very hard to make sure that's the case. I think on a macro level, then we need to really understand, you know, how we can influence at a national level the governments in order to make them understand the impacts that tourism has on their destinations, and for policies to be put in place that they can really understand that and try to give back. And I know there's many examples with the Travel Foundation where they do projects within destinations, with local communities, with local people, in order to give back to these, in order to be engaged with the stakeholders, so that actually they see the benefits of travel as well. And I think if we can take these approaches, really understand who is being impacted both positively and negatively, engage with those stakeholders and put in plans, structured processes and structured programs that address some of these issues, then we don't end up getting a situation that potentially we're in some of the more mature destinations.
I'd just like to think back a little bit to the Venetian situation, because there it's quite clear that the number of people who are coming as day trippers, what you called, Antonella, jumpers, these people contribute very little to the economy, and they don't, of course, even pay any kind of tickets. You're talking about ticketing in certain areas. I know Harold Goodwin has talked about ticketing going into certain villages in the Gambia. You know, in other words, some mechanism by which the payment is made which actually redresses the balance, because at the moment you have residents who are 58,000 having to pay for all the costs of these jumpers, as it were, coming in from outside, who pay nothing. And therefore they feel that's a very unfair balance. Now, I just wonder if we talk, first of all, to Nikki, and then we ask Marcio to come in with another perspective. I mean, do you have any view about whether it's reasonable in a democratic society to ask people to pay some kind of tickets like going into an exhibition? Whether that's something that could or should be entertained, so you limit the number of tickets in a day or something like this? Is this a proposition that would be possible, do you think?
That's an interesting one and a tough one, and obviously the fact that we're still talking about this year after year, it's not an easy solution. To Gary's point, that this has an impact on those in the community, it has impact on those offering the tourism, and no one's really joining that up at the moment, from what I see. I'll come to your point in a minute, Martin, if that's okay, but certainly from all the conversations and listening to the panellists here, I'm trying to think, I've never had a tourist board work with us, and we work with an awful lot in various different parts of the world, come and say, how do I get less tourists? Yeah. It's always about how do I get more tourists in terms of the overall country, the cities, and there isn't any real joined up thinking about what is that type of tourism that we want. And I think it said colleagues here have mentioned about the fact that tourism needs to be planned more, and they need to have a vision on that, and linking that vision of what they want the tourism to be through to the types of experiences the customer wants as well. It has to be, you have to tread very carefully, because if you end up in a situation where you're making things exclusive by ticketing, for example, do you would end up making it only affordable to a small group of people, and then you start to have an elitism coming through in tourism.
You can avoid that.
But would that happen realistically if people see that they're limiting the numbers when no destinations actually want less tourists? From what I'm seeing so far, no one's asking for less tourists. And if they're going to put tickets on that, then it becomes even more exclusive to try and get those tickets. So I do worry that if you go for that approach, that it might well have that unintended consequence down the line in terms of actually limiting numbers of tourists. But it's thinking about being more creative with the partners involved. So thinking about the disbursement of tourists, for example. We hear here about where you can actually send the tourists in other areas linked to the core city. That at the moment, I don't think those messages get through really, really well. The tourists have got this picture of what they want to see in a particular city, and it's to tick off the list and say they've done that. But hearing here examples where there are things around the area that you can take the tourists to.
Yeah, but that if you think about the situation in Barcelona where people are coming and staying not in the tourist areas because they're buying Airbnb and they're staying in people's rooms in some area of the city which is residential, they're already being spread, and very significantly so. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? He says it's a reality.
It's a reality, it
but
is a reality.
But is it something that needs to be managed, and like you have licenses of hotels? I mean, is it something that a new balance has to be struck?
Absolutely, and certainly from our point of view, we see that anybody, new players coming into the market, there should be a level playing field. So whatever type of accommodation you are, that you are all working to that level playing field. And if you are dispersing people from an accommodation aspect, quite often it's not the accommodation bit that's the problem from what we're hearing, it's the actual excursions and going into the core cultural elements, the bits that people really want to see on that trip. Not necessarily purely the accommodation and where they're based at that point, but they're all congregating and coming into central points.
It's a mixture.
Yes, it is a mixture, but predominantly. And if you actually look at the statistics of what the UK market is actually looking to do, city breaks are looking on the increase. Each year we've seen that more and more so. So we've got to think about how you actually manage that going forward. And we've started to have dialogues with certain destinations where people are looking a little bit more at a planned vision, but they're planning it in silos. They're not all coming together and talking to each other about what that holistic vision is of their destination, because everybody's still wanting to get that economic value out of it without understanding what the overall impact is if you limit numbers or if you change the type of tourism. Everyone's slightly nervous about making that first move, from my opinion.
Right, we have no evidence of a strategic plan yet in Venice. People talk about it, but there isn't yet one there. You have strategic plan, you have some discussions, long discussions. You say that people haven't really come together yet. Marcio, what is your view around the world about other cities around the world and the way they tackle things as distinct from Barcelona and Venice?
Martin, in fact, this is kind of a new problem. Yeah. As it was mentioned here before, most countries, destinations, they are seeking for more tourists. And the problems of the cities around the world, not only from, I'm not talking about a tourism perspective, but normally the problems are related to congestion, to poverty, to many negative things. And here is a problem generated by affluence. And it's a new problem. The population of the world is more and more urban, and it's going to continue to be more and more. Yeah. Most tourism in the world, not only international but also domestically, is urban or through cities. Yeah. So this is likely to be a growing problem. In the, let's say, in the international community, and we've just seen last month in the UN, when the Sustainable Development Goals, the new Sustainable Development Goals for the next 15 years, they were approved. One of them relates directly to cities, and I brought this here. It's goal number 11, make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So this is, tourism is part of this, let's say, overall situation. I think that we have here two interesting cases. One, as we learned from Antonella, very little governance, if any, in the growth of Venice as a tourism destination. And Barcelona, maybe we could say that now you are feeling the pains of growth, of success. So I think that only discussions, planning, bringing together all stakeholders would be able to face the situation, to bring a solution. As we know, a destination, to be good for tourists, has to be good for their residents. And now we have the feeling that, well, it's only been good for tourists, but not really for the visitors.
What we're arguing is that they are up to a point beneficial for visitors. If there are too many people, then there are visitors who are congestion averse. You know, if you want to go to a wilderness and then you encounter somebody else, evidently it's no longer a wilderness. I mean, that's an exaggeration at the other end and not in cities, to make the point. So you have congestion averse residents, visitors, and you also have tourism dependent residents and non-tourism dependent residents, and they have very different interests. And it's a question of how you manage those.
Yes.
Now, actually what you've talked about, Jordi, is the stakeholders, and also, Gary, you talked about the stakeholders being involved. Now, in the end, who is going to be the referee in this? Is this going to be the municipal authorities? How do they find a way of striking a balance, is the question.
Yes, Martin, as it has been said before, it's not, there's no easy answer, no easy solution.
Yeah.
But I think that the residents, the municipality, municipality and the private sector, the local stakeholders, they have to discuss it and see how they can benefit more from tourism, how they can spread more the benefit, and throughout the year and territorially speaking. We've discussed about here the issues of seasonality, how tourism takes place and benefit is concentrated, congestion concentrated, and can be more distributed throughout the territory. But overall, it has to be good for the local residents. Venice, like other cities in the world, they are World Heritage. So the people of the world, they have the right and the desire to have access to those heritage sites. So the locals have to build the system in such a way that they can, let's say, give that opportunity for people to visit, to experience, but also have the benefit from being there, from having the benefit from tourism.
That's very well to say, but if there are too many people, how do you decide to limit it? The problem, it seems to me, and which I ask you to think through, is this, is that if you're going to reduce the numbers, and we've never come across any city which is prepared to reduce the numbers, even though it may benefit a number of the residents, they actually want to seek some other way of it creating other activities which are non-touristic activities, which will then engage people economically. So there's a rebalancing. And this is really, in many ways, what Antonella has been talking about. But in the end, you've got to find a way of limiting them. And yet nobody is prepared at the moment to seek to limit. And it's intriguing that people talk about spreading, about this and that, but nobody's prepared to say, this must be limited. They say, if you go to Venice, as I did recently, to a meeting, they generally said, at the moment, I asked them, what's it like? And they said, it's a disaster. It can't go on as it is. But we can't see a way of actually introducing any change. Now, that's a sort of odd situation when actually we have a developed world. It's, as you say, it's a problem of success. And there should be a way of that we can find to get a better balance. And so this is what I put to you. How do we find those?
It's already happening.
Huh?
It's this limitation.
Come here? No?
This,
No?
no.
No?
No. Yeah. This limitation, this type of control, let's say, is already taking place in, let's say, in different attractions, but not in cities overall. We know that. So
Apart from Venice.
yeah, in Granada we have that
Absolutely.
that situation. Now to access the site, the heritage site, it's only basically almost only through the internet. You have hours to start the visit. There is a limitation. There must be. We see that in natural attractions as well. There is a limitation of so many people can go by day. These are, let's say, experiences, and now for many years, that eventually will bring more information, knowledge on how to deal with bigger situations, bigger, let's say, areas.
Yeah.
It's we don't let's say prescribe a solution, but because this is a new problem that is coming up and needs a lot of discussion to see how we deal with to deal with it.
Yeah. Yes, you were going to say, Jordi, something.
I think that, or at least all the cities which are facing this reality are trying to cope with the possibilities. One, in terms, for example, of lodging, I think there are three criteria which is fundamental to take into account. One, security. Security for the visitor, security for the citizens. Second, transparency. We need to know what's the real offer in that city or in the neighborhood. Third, fiscality. Where this money, at least everybody has to pay, the platform and the one who is offering the apartment. That's one area. Second, I think the money which are taken in terms of ticketing or tax de séjour or whatever, where does this money goes to? To protect the destiny, because I think there are two criteria at this moment. One, promotion, yes, we have to keep going on promotion, but, and that's the new challenge some cities are facing, how do we protect those areas? Are we doing some investment especially for the residents? It's not a question of cleaning and lighting. It's a question, do I receive a specific benefit in my house from that, let's say, noisy activity? And the third is the challenge, the chart of rights and also challenges of a visitor.
Yeah.
A visitor has a right, but do a resident has an obligation? How do they behave? Are they going to behave in the same way where I go out that in the way I'm staying at home? Do we allow people to be drinking and singing at 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock at night in your city? Is that acceptable when you are a visitor? I think these are the real issues at this moment we are facing in Barcelona, and that's what we are trying to say. You ask me, where do these solutions come on? I'd say, in a debate which is already having in the city between the stakeholders, let's say the private sector and let's say the public sector. And I would say that although it's interesting, the elements it's coming on is on those lines I'm just mentioning, and I think we'll keep going on.
So you think then that if we were talking to you in 3 years' time, you'd have found a new balance to the one you have now?
Well, in 3 years' time, I hope that we'll win again the Champions League. That's something we like to do, especially against whether it's Chelsea, whether United, so Arsenal. So for sure we'll have already win it again. And I think at least in 3 years' time, this debate will be clearly on table, and I would say this new strategic plan will have already fixed the criteria and work it. Some things are already been implemented. This agreement with the province has already been implemented. Some areas of ticketing already been implemented. Some have to be implemented. The discussion is what and where. Do coaches from outside have to be ticketed, for example, July and August? When is the problem? Do we have? Some cities are doing it. So that thing is the model we have to do. We don't have to neglect ourselves to discuss some taboos. Everything has to be open.
Yeah. Yes, Antonella.
I would like to bring a... Hello?
Good.
Thank you. So I'd like to bring a different angle on this discussion, because I think that, of course, it's a very delicate subject that involves the decision makers, so the stakeholders, the governmental offices that so far, also in Venice, they're collecting a lot of money, because imagine that only the city tax with a very small relative city is more than 25 millions of euro. But the question is, and I always raise this question to all the, let's say, governmental and municipality officers, where the money goes. Because if they don't reinvest in a strategic plan on tourism, they will always have July and August or June people that are jumping in the city. So my perspective will be, because we are here at the World Trade Market, and it's important to see that probably one of the answers is to change the perception of the product of Venice. These millions of people are coming because they have in mind a product that is easy to consume. They get there, they go to some market, they take a picture, they go home. So if that's the way to consume Venice, probably we are doing something wrong in the way we are selling the product. So we need to move from a very basic and transactional product that is easy to access for millions into something that is a little bit more into the cores of the heritage of the city, more sophisticated, with a different price, because the price equation is a function of value for money. What do you want to have for a fantastic experience? A city where you fall in love, what's the price for that? And you change completely the perspective. So also for the inhabitants, their role should be, because they should live more and more about the industry of tourism, not only the passivity of tourism, they should be the mindsetters of new ways of selling, new ways to experience the city, opening up their palazzos, opening up the hidden gardens, opening up the access to the lagoon discovery places, and also on the food industry, because they can be a vitrine for the exceptional way of experience some food that is not only the junk food in some of the not anymore Italian restaurants downtown in Venice. So if that's true, also the digital market, because we are here in the techie theater of the World Trade Market, how we can change through the sharing, the experience and the social network, a different way to desire Venice differently. Because if we desire differently, then we can build a different value equation. And then people will be not scared to come in the winter, because summer cannot give the same experience. So I think it's a different way also to use the tool that we have. We need to invest also in building a different, let's say, mindset and consciousness about it's not only something that comes from the cloud and from a different authority or governmental. It's our way also to do business. Less transactional, less, let's say, gondolas, no, with all due respect, but something that is exceptional. And in the exceptional, you can really move the affluence from a peak time into a different time of the year. And in a way, it becomes a way to do yield management as well.
Very interesting. Have you got something you wanted to add, Nicky? I looked as if you were just about to say
was.
something. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, just coming back to, I mean, that's now starting to sound like a vision about what
Yeah.
you want your tourism to look like, and I
Yeah.
think that's what's been lacking so often, is that balance between having a vision versus just having a KPI which is about numbers. And for many, many years now, it's just been about numbers, and somehow you've got to balance that vision of what you want tourism to look like, so you can continue to offer some sort of authentic experience. Otherwise, the vision that you might have is not going to marry to that authentic experience at all, and the expectations of the customers of what they think they're going to get, the negative consequences of that, and then they just come and go very, very quickly. I think we'll just keep compounding that until you said you marry up some sort of vision for what you want your overall tourism to look like.
Gary, can I just ask you, if you think about the kind of much of the product that you're involved in offering, in a sense, is much of it's an invention. You know, there are these invented places which actually are very attractive and people love to escape to. If you're going to cities, apart from places like Venice, actually you're going to places which are in themselves authentic places. You know, if you go to Sao Paulo or to Rio or something, they may have some kind of invention, but they are authentic places.
Well,
And-
our biggest destination as TUI is in the summer Mallorca, and I think the Mallorquins would probably take exception to being told that they don't live in an authentic place. I don't think anywhere, any destination in the world is not authentic. The fact that it's there, the fact that there's a community, the fact that there are people living there makes it authentic. Now, the one thing I think we're missing in this whole discussion, which I find quite baffling, is we're talking about the consequence of the sheer numbers of customers who are arriving in Barcelona. These customers don't morph out of the pavement. Over 75% of them arrive on an aircraft. And the airport is built in order to bring this amount of customers in. This was a national decision made by the Spanish government, made by the local authorities. Where do they think these customers are going to go if they're allowing 300-400 flights a day to arrive into their destination? And to then go to stakeholders 3-4 times down the value chain and say, you guys need to get together and sort it out. No, bugger that. You need to tell us what your strategic plan is, why you've built an airport of the size that takes that amount of capacity, why you're allowing cruise ships with 2,000 berths to come in one after the other on a Saturday. You need to tell us how we deal with that, not us. Because you know, it's not the hoteliers, it's not the local community, it's not the small guys who are building huge international berths for cruise ships or building huge international airports. Yeah. This is done at a national level, and there has to be a national policy which deals with that.
Yeah. Very interesting. Right, so can you answer that?
I agree totally with him, except for the national policy. I agree with the fact of the airport and the port, but unfortunately this doesn't fit for national policies. It's more on local or regional basis, but I agree with you. Now, one point you meant, and I think Venice also said, is how we add value for a destination. How we put cities or regions or whatever you are talking in value. And it's not a question of make it like you say, or you don't say it, but in the possibility of just as, how we call it, something cheap. No, I think territories have a value. It's not a question of making it cheaper. It's just a question of what you think when you're talking about the city. You meant at the beginning, young and fun. Well, this is, from our point of view, and that's the challenge, totally against our position. We are working against that.
I know.
And it's not easy to change that perception, but then you have to make strategies and to make the focus in new programs. That's what we are working now in a new, let's say, options. 40% of the people who come to Barcelona are repetitors. So they come at least another one time. So what we have to do is, apart from Sagrada Familia, I don't want to sell any more Sagrada Familia. So I have to offer new cities, new challenges, new programs, etc. So I don't want to be a commodity. And it's true, I mean, the city break, in fact, the third city best communicated within Europe is Barcelona, apart from, let's say, these wonderful London airports, which never works because it's always foggy. But apart from that, the third is Barcelona. So what to do the weekend? Let's people come there. You have a fancy foggy weather. We have rain today, so we share weather today with you. But apart from that, that's why it's a success. But we have to be careful not dying from the success. That's the challenge, not dying, because as it is figures and figures and figures and growing and growing and growing, the challenge is not to be focused only on the figures, but on the value, on the return. So what we have, let me put a contradiction today. The last, let's say, city government went into government last May and decided to make a moratorium on the building of hotels and lodging, etc. It has two sizes, the coin, as everything has in life. From one part of the challenge, the entrepreneurs, the funds, etc., say, oh, a mess. And it's a negative message in terms of business friendly. It's true. But on the other side, it has a positive image because it makes the prices go up. The contradiction. So what we have to look at is not a question only of the final budget, of course you have to, but what is the perception of the visitor and what is the perception of your resident? And that's the key. And it makes the need to put value on that. Because if not, people will get fed up and then finally they won't come. And that's, let's say, the risk in 10 years' time, etc. So we don't want to become an easy and cheapy destination. We don't want. No. So we prefer to do ticketing, we prefer to do all these policies to make people realize that they're having and coming to a special place. And I agree with you. I mean, if we built a big airport and a big port, it's to use it, not to become it as a museum. That's true. That's obvious.
Yes, Marcio, one of the last comments, actually.
Okay. As, let's say, a last comment is that we know very well we have to strike the balance, but in the end, tourism has to bring value to the destination, has to the local community. So, of course, the tourists want to have an experience, they're paying for it, but tourism has to add value to what a destination is. So it has to help make it better than it was before having the tourism flow. And here I'm not just talking about cities, but also natural destinations or conservation areas. You want to take tourists there? Okay, fine, but let's do it in such a way that the tourism flow will bring more value to that, will help the conservation of the place, will help, let's say, avoid the local communities to destroy, to avoid them destroying the place. So tourism, in the end, has to bring more value, has to make the place better than it was before.
Is it, would you say that tourism, in a sense, for a city or any other area, is a means to an end, exactly, even if for the tourist it is an end in itself?
Exactly. Yes.
If there are these two aspects.
Tourism is an instrument, is a means to an end.
Yes.
And very clearly, in the, I mentioned before, the Sustainable Development Goals,
yes,
tourism is mentioned 3 times there explicitly, yeah, as an instrument for the generation of jobs and promoting local cultures, as a means to helping shift the economy to a better consumption and production pattern, and also to help better manage the marine resources. So in all 3 of them, tourism is an instrument, and that's why it's there. It's not an end to itself.
Absolutely. You're going to say? Yeah.
Just, if you look, for example, here, there are some pavilions, and that's the experience of Spain. I mean, we have been very good in talking about sun and beach. That's what you think about Spain, the Canary Islands, Andalusia, Mallorca, sun and beach. Great. Now, in terms of cities, we are facing, let's say, the first inverted commas crisis of how to deal tourism cities. But this is the same phenomena, I would say, which is also taking place around Europe. Because if you look to Amsterdam, it's also facing the same problem. If you look to Prague, it's also facing the same problem. Some parts of Berlin is also the same problems. Parts of Paris, they also all talk at Disney Paris.
Yeah.
So this is a new phenomenon. We have been able to talk about how we adapt the resorts, how to make it interesting in terms of sun and beach. But the cities are just taking, let's say, the knowledge of how to deal and how to make this balance, as you said very clearly. So I would say this is not something which is going to reduce. I mean, the concept of blocking, reducing, etc., is not in any table. It can be. If you look to the World Tourism Organization, they put 1,070 million last year, and the prospects is 1,200 million in 5 years. So it's not going to go down, it's going to go up. And that's the forecast, because the middle classes of India and China are just jumping into the scenario. So that's what it's going to be. So the stupid thing is to say, I don't want any more to come. No, they're going to come because they have an airport, they have a port, or whatever. So the best solution is to start thinking in certain consensus of what are we expecting also a visitor to do. Can we block an apartment if they're making noises? Do we do it in our countries? Why don't we do it when you're a visitor? Do we respect the sleeping of our vicinity? Why don't we respect the sleeping on where you're going abroad? It seems obvious, but we don't do it. I think it's a question of challenging people. They have rights, but they also have obligations. And it's something we have to also do. It's not a question of having an apartment. For me, the apartment is not the problem. For me, the problem is how do they behave? That's a challenge.
Antonella.
Just one word on one missed concept that we probably can bring up to the discussion, and it's the increasing the level of knowledge and education. To change the perception of a very transactional tourism, we need to invest a lot more into the art of hospitality, because so many people are trying, example in Venice, to become let's say players in this type of thing. Not even an industry, because they're using now their semi-apartments. The same people that are complaining because the city is busy, they're investing with their own private apartments and they're living outside the city. So bringing the rules is very important, but also creating a different learning model. We need to have hospitality education at high level of university level in a city like Venice. A city with 25 million of potential clients and customers every year doesn't have an hospitality industry and an hospitality university. So that's critical, because if you imagine cities like Geneva, that is a beautiful city, they have like 3 universities for tourism and they have a tenth of the visitors like Venice. So they cannot even practice, and we should bring them over. So that's a contradiction if you think about that. And then they have fantastic chef schools, and they have in, let's say, in other part of the countries, different type of model. So again, one of the projects is to create in Venice one international academy for cuisine, because then food, it becomes the language of exchange. Even if you don't speak the language, and Spain is a fantastic example, and Italy as well, with the Expo, food is speaking the language of all kind of parts in the world. But then you need to do a different choice. Either you teach seriously how to use the groceries, the product, the sustainability, and the life cycle, or you just consume the food. And the cities are exactly the same. We need to teach people how not consume the cities.
Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry that you've not had time for questions, but they've been coming after talking and talking and talking, I think very constructively with a lot of insight. This is clearly an area for study to begin to understand. You have been wrestling already with these issues, and I'm sure we will be wanting to repeat this kind of activity in many different places around the world as we begin to encounter more and more of these urban pressures that you, Jordi, were explaining is almost certain to come with these other countries around the world with their middle classes wanting to travel. So thank you very much, Antonella, Jordi, Gary, Nikki and Marcio, for a very interesting insight into managing of cities, and particularly Barcelona and Venice. Thank you very much.
emailed you.